How do I enable screen share?
Uh,
Because I'm always out of space on my phone and my laptop. So. Uh, oh yeah, what are the mission? So we are talking about React UI, and yeah. So we are. The question was about. So So hi Sid. Um, Welcome to this vlog of we are trying to understand the React UI that you have created, and it's being quite well. I see a lot of buzz on Twitter about that, and a lot of people are looking at it. I see a lot of contributions also from people. So today we are going to just take a look around, what exactly the library is, what are the various concepts that you have used on that. And yeah, maybe we'll go through some sample codes. So, but before that, let's know a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your overall journey in the front end arena.
oh wow, okay. So I started coding around 7 years ago, and I instantly liked front end mostly because like nobody else liked it. Like I didn't come from a computer science background. I went to school for physics. So when I joined my first company, uh, we had a lot of people with computer science background, and everyone wanted to do like the cool backend stuff, and nobody wanted to write CSS.
Yeah.
And it's just like as the new guy, I was like, okay, fine, I'll do the thing that nobody else wants to do. And then like I really liked the direction in which after that my career has gone, where I spent some time doing front end, and then I started becoming more full stack, then node with Node.js, and then got it got into like database design and all of that. So I did that for like a very brief while, and then I realized that this is boring. Front end is just so much more interesting.
Mm.
So then I came back, and then I've been doing a lot of front end. So I did some front end at a healthcare startup in India that was Practo. And then after that, I joined the design system team at Auth0 and stayed there for a while. And then now I work as a front end developer at Code Sandbox. So I've kind of hopped into different spaces, but always kind of go back to front end wherever I go.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a pretty much similar story for me, like, around, I think, 2014, when Angular was just coming up.
Mhm.
And we saw a lot of opportunity in there because nobody wanted to code, especially CSS was like, a total no-no for backend developers. And nobody wanted to get into front-end development. Initially, they used to kind of look down upon the term was UI developers at that time. Like, they used to say, okay, any kind of styling that you want to do, it's UI development, like we are not going to do. And we saw an opportunity in there,
Okay.
and I really liked that thing. Like, I actually liked working on the front end side, so it's really interesting. So, and how did you get on with React? Like, why not Angular or other framework?
So when I started with Angular because I want to say React didn't exist then.
Yeah.
Like 7 years ago, I don't think React, or maybe it just came up. I don't know. But yeah, so I started with Angular 1 and then did that for a while. And in fact, like we re-architected our app with the best Angular practices and everything while I was there. But then there was like some interesting overlap in what I was doing at the time, where I was doing less and less tech or less and less code and more review and more design, like database design and like that side of thing, like more into helping my teammates do their things, right?
Hmm.
And then I felt like that is also when like ES5 to ES6 jump started happening and React
Yeah.
came out and Bitpack came out. And I felt like I was just, there was so much happening and it did not feel like a good time to be managing people. It felt like this is the best time to be in front end, right? And catch the wave. That's kind of what brought me to like React, where I was just exploring what's the hype, and I really liked it.
Hmm.
And it kind of it basically like matched my mental model of components, uh, because that's the way I was always structuring my CSS. Right, that's how I was used to doing styling. And I mean, like the concept has been around for a really long time, right? Like designers have always done components, right? Or what do you call it, like stencils, and like they've had multiple terms for it throughout the years. But then like that whole model matched my, I don't know, just the how I like to think about code a lot. So I instantly got hooked, and then I don't know, I just basically stick with React for a while.
Hmm.
Part of it was like in the day job, outside the day job, and then React kind of became my full-time job soon after that.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I first saw Angular JS 1.x, I thought
Mm-hmm.
like there can't be anything better than this. Like this is going to be the future.
Mm-hmm.
And when I heard about virtual DOM for the first time and immutability, I was like, where was this? Like for such a long time. Like why didn't we think about this before? And yeah, and I think things totally changed after that. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm still not sure if like virtual DOM and immutability are like the core or more like the exciting features about React.
Hmm.
I think that was just like the hook they got people with, like this is more
Yeah.
performant, come look at us.
Yeah.
But I think the composition model is what is the what do you say, MVP there.
Yeah.
Like the DOM virtual DOM happens behind the scenes. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
As long as it's fast, it's good.
Yeah. So let's get started with the library. Tell us something
Mhm.
about React UI, what the library is, and why did you start it?
Sure. So I've been working on React UI for a few months. It's essentially, let me tell you how I got to this point. So it's essentially a set of all the things I've tried to learn over the years. So before like working at Code Sandbox, I was working at the design system team at Auth0. And I learned a lot about how can you build a library that, okay, let me explain. My job was essentially in the design team. Like I was an engineer sitting in the design team where we would build components, come up with tokens, and then the shipped product would go to the product teams. So we had like product engineering teams, and they would consume our components to build stuff on it. And that kind of really brought to me like two things that I hadn't thought about earlier. One was how does design translate into code, right? And I've always had this like throughout my career before that, like the design and developer like friction,
Hmm.
right? There's this like, I don't know, it's like boys versus girls. Like
Yeah.
there's no logic to it, but it's just there, right? It's just existed throughout.
Yeah.
Uh, so I kind of like worked in that space where my job was essentially to work with designers and work with engineers and be in the middle. Uh, and then the other side of it was we had to build components without knowing anything about the app. So then a lot of the composition, a lot of how do we structure our APIs became very important. And I honestly kind of miss working on some of those things. Plus, at Code Sandbox, I've continued to like go deeper into front end and learn a lot about the design process here. And so React UI essentially is like a attempt to bring all of those learnings, like design focused learnings and good APIs, into like a library that basically is open source and you can use it to build whatever you want.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Like when I went through your site, so just for reference for our users, like it's React -ui.dev. So it does list down a lot of old and new concepts about React and UI development in general, and the ones that you have incorporated there. So maybe start with the basic building blocks of it. So you mentioned about design tokens and component tokens there. Can you elaborate a little bit for us, like who have never heard about this term before? What exactly are these?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. All right. Um, so few things to point out. One is that this is the domain react-ui.dev. And the second thing to point out is that it's still in beta. So I'm like actively working on it right now. It's far from done. And if you go to the like the homepage, the first thing that you'd see is there's this post about old and new ideas. So even if you don't find component libraries interesting, I'd still recommend to just give this one page a read because there's a lot of interesting things here. So at the core of like React UI is this concept of design tokens. And design tokens are essentially, you can, like one way to look at them is treat them like variables, that these are variables that you set at the start of your project, or more like at the core of your project. And then you try to follow these variables everywhere. So a very simple example of this would be that I have this header example here, which has a color, right? And so instead of hard coding this in the header, what I do is I pull it out in a CSS variable, and it says it's this color and give it a name. So for example, the name here is brand background dark, and the header component actually uses the variable instead of the hard-coded value. So this is what it looks like in practice, but then what you're essentially trying to do is you're trying to take all of the decisions that your application or that you have made in your styling and put it in a central space, right? So it's almost like creating a config for yourself. And then this can extend to a lot of things. So for example, it can extend to typography, right? So this is something that most designers do, which is they create a scale for themselves of these are the font sizes I want to use, these are the spacing tokens I want to use, and then they take all of them and put it in almost like a config essentially. So that's what I've tried to like take the same approach here, where you start with essentially a config of spacing values, config of your colors, and then in your components, you reference these colors by their name. So the everything in the config is essentially a token, is a variable, and then you use these variables in the app. One example where this would like really be apparent is, let's say you have a alert, right? And it's a danger warning kind of alert. So it has a certain red text and it has a certain red background. Now, if you have another destructive thing, like you have a danger zone in your application, or you have a notification which is danger, or you have a button that's a danger button, you'd want these to be similar. You want them to have the same styles. So then it's useful to declare a token, and you can have a token which is just the color of red that you choose, or it can be, you can name something like that, like this is my destructive background, this is my destructive foreground, and then all of the components that are destructive use the same token. So it kind of helps you give a consistent vibe to your entire application. That's the concept of like design tokens.
Okay.
And so in React, yeah, we kind of use the system UI theme specification. This is the same spec that theme UI uses, if you're familiar with Gatsby and Gatsby themes. Uh, and so we like React UI adopts the same theme spec. And so the example above with CSS is just like to help you as an example. But everything in React UI is CSS in JavaScript because it's focused on like that part of the world. So even the config is defined in JavaScript essentially.
Okay. So since you brought out that term, there's a lot of fight in the UI world about CSS in JavaScript. Is it like a good or evil? What's your take on that?
So it's a tool, right? It's what do you say? It's silly to like figure out if the tool itself is useful or not, right? Because you kind of have to look at the problem space as well. So if you, for example, like the problem space that I'm trying to focus on with React UI is React projects that have a consistent theming system, right? So in a system like this, CSS and JS really helps you. But for example, if I also had to build another product which uses Vue, right, or which uses vanilla, like no framework, it uses CSS files, CSS and JS would be a very bad tool for that, right? Because you're kind of locked into this JavaScript environment. So it's really good for the use case, but like, I don't know, like a lot of complaints that I hear about CSS and JS is that it's not useful outside of its space, which is true. I mean, the criticism is fair, just that it's good at a few things and it's bad at everything else.
Yeah, makes sense. So do you have like a sample application that you can show us that has used React UI?
Sure. So let me start with something like very small. Okay, so if I go to the homepage, I think I have examples there. Yeah. Wait, I have this open. Yeah, so this is a sandbox of like some like just snippets essentially, right? Just to give you a feel of like what does the code look like. So to build something like this tiny card, this is an example. Guess this is a simple card. Yep. So here you see like you're doing two things essentially. One is that you are importing the tokens and the components from the themes. And React UI has like 2 or 3 themes. You can also create your own theme. I can show you what the theme looks like. And you wrap your entire application in a theme provider, and then all your components are essentially themed. So for example, if I go to this simple block, I'm importing 3 or 4 components from React UI. It's a card, like this whole thing is a card. It's in a stack component, which is a flex extension. And there's an avatar, and then there's like this text over here. So a few things which are interesting here is that the gap stack has a gap property. The avatar has some sizes. The text has a variant and a size, right? So it seems like there are some like, what do you say, like theme properties that you can give to your components, but at the same time, you can also give CSS to your properties. So for example, this card, I can say this should have this width, and I can say this should have a box shadow of like the entire string, whatever CSS I want.
Okay. Yeah, that looks very interesting. So, so even these layouts of stack and everything is created as components within React UI.
Yes.
Okay. And
Yeah,
what
so it
have you
has,
used internally for that? Like, is it Flexbox or?
so there are 2 layouts. Let me actually go to the layouts page. There are 2 layouts. There's a stack and there's a grid. So stack is good for putting things like stack them together with some gap in them. So for example, this stack is aligned to center and there's a gap of 2 units of space, right? Which is kind of based on your space tokens.
Okay.
And then you can like stack multiple things. And then, so all of this is still stack. Like you can create something as complex as this, which is stack, like nest multiple stacks together. And then comes like, sometimes you need like more like higher level components. So then you go for a grid. Like I make all my layouts with grid. So you have grid and column, which is using CSS grid under the hood.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned that these components are responsive, right? So can you give us, like show us a sample of how to make your components responsive?
Yeah, so I think the grid is my favorite example to show something like this. So, so a lot of times, like you have this as a page layout, right? And then this is my header, this is my sidebar, and this is my main, right?
Yeah.
Now, depending on like the UI, you might want to make them behave differently, right? So you see on smaller screens, you change the sidebar, and then if it's extremely small, then you just stack them vertically. And these are like layout features. So a lot of the like all of the CSS syntax in React UI follows the responsive syntax from Theme UI, and which basically looks like this. You give an, instead of giving one value, you give an array of values, and these correspond to your breakpoints. So
Okay.
if I show you a theme, let me show you the light theme. Wait, is that behind me or behind you?
Oh yeah, I think somebody is cleaning up his garden. Let me close this.
So uh, within like your tokens, like the configuration that we talked about in the start, you can mention your breakpoints. So for example, I have these 3 breakpoints where the first one is just, this one is built for like mobile. Then I have another breakpoint for tablet. And then this is for bigger screens. And then I kind of get these 3 viewports, right? And then these are like, of course, customizable. So you can create your own. And now what happens is every time you give an array, the first one corresponds to the first breakpoint, the second one to the second breakpoint, third to the next breakpoint. So if I have to like show this in like the simplest example, let's look at this card. And I'm going to like, instead of width 200, I'm going to give an array. So I can say 100, 200, 300. And you see on like the smallest screen, it's 100. When I make it bigger, it becomes 200. When it's the third viewport, it becomes 300,
Okay.
right? So of course, this is like, you would never want 100, 200, but you can do things like, the most common thing I do is with layouts, where if you look at this layout, let me move my screen. So in this screen, you have enough space to fit all of these. But then as you go smaller, they kind of, you can change the stack values so that they can align different ways.
Okay. And is there a way to specify, let's say, portrait versus landscape orientation? No?
No, but that's something interesting to think about.
Yeah. Mostly I'm thinking from the mobile side of it, like when I'm holding the mobile this way or that way. Sometimes you want to show it different ways.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's also like a viewport. Like it's still a certain size of it,
hmm,
right? But it might just be useful to introduce another size in between, which
hmm.
is not all the way tablet, but maybe landscape. So the interesting thing is that like all of this is dynamic. So you can say, I'm going to create 4 viewports,
Okay.
and then everywhere you want a responsive syntax, in the array you give 4 values instead of 3.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, you also mentioned about accessibility in the library. So if I have to make my components accessible, okay, first of all, what's your definition of a component being accessible? Like, what are the primary things that one should look at, and how do you do that in the library?
Okay, so that's a very loaded question.
Yeah.
So let me start by saying like all of the components that are here. So like we've also built like some components, not just primitives. And then we try to make components accessible. So let me find a easy one. So for example, breadcrumbs, this component is accessible, and there are like multiple layers of this. So there's like so many kinds of accessibility. So you have something like vision, right? Are the contrasts good enough? Is there enough separation between them? If somebody is vision impaired and they're using the screen reader, do we have the right tags so that things are correctly announced? So for example, in this component, you will see that it's a list, right? It's not just divs, it's a list. And then you'd have a data role somewhere. Yeah, there's an aria label on this, which is a breadcrumb. And then each one of these is a list item and it has the right tags. Similarly, if you look at something like a tooltip, you'll find the same things. If you look at a form, let me look at a form, because form is I think most people understand the form example. It's pretty common. Um, so if you use a form, it comes with a label and it comes with an input, and then these IDs and for is auto-generated, but it tries to like automate a lot of this accessibility work so that, when the screen reader is announcing these things, they come in context. So that's like one layer of it. Then there are things like keyboard accessibility. So some components in React UI are based on Reach UI, right? So for example, our menu component is based on Reach menu, and we borrow all of the keyboard accessibility features from them. Plus all of these have the right labels as well. So
Okay.
there's like vision, keyboard, and screen reader, like all of those are covered. And then there's the last one, which is like the default themes. Like we have a light theme and a dark theme. Are these themes, do they have the right color contrast ratios? Uh, and right now they don't. Like we think like most of our components are accessible, but some of them aren't. So that's something that I'm still working on, that the default themes at least should be accessible right out of the box.
Okay. So the users can specify more than two themes, or let's say if they want
Mm-hmm.
like light, dark, and bold contrast kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
also possible, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
to go back to like the token and components concept, so both of these light and dark themes are basically exposing both of those things. They're exposing their tokens and their component styles, which you pass to your theme provider. So you don't have to use the default themes. You can create your own tokens and component styles. and then pass those. So all of the theming essentially happens at the theme provider level. And then how many themes you want is kind of up to you. You can keep creating new ones. And as long as you follow the same, specification, you can do whatever you want.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds interesting. So while we are on theme, I saw this list of font sizes below here, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
have mentioned 5 or 6 font sizes.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a recommendation about how many font sizes we should ideally define for our application and how many font sizes to use in a particular page?
Um, Kind of. So, from a specification point of view, the light theme I think ships with like 10 of them, and but if you're creating your own application, then there's also a base theme, which is like it doesn't have a lot of opinions. It just has some basic sizes. So that also ships with like these 10 sizes, which are customizable. Um, because React UI essentially is like this config, this tokens based, you are free to define your own tokens. So, for example, if your application only uses 3 sizes in total, right? You don't have to define all 10 of them. You can basically, in this object, just have 3 values. But I've tried to like find a nice balance between if you if if you have like a design team and if you have your design language already well defined, then you can port it to React UI. But if you don't have a design team, or if you're not a designer, like I'm not a designer, so I've tried to create like a nice base set for myself where when I start, I can just start with the base and then keep customizing as I go. So there is no recommendation, or there is no, what do you say? It's something that I can't really enforce,
Hmm.
and I don't want to enforce. It's really up to the people who use it in the application. But at the same time, the base themes and the default themes have a lot of like they kind of have some opinions already baked in. So
Yeah.
if you don't have your own opinions, you can take my opinions and then change them as you go.
Yeah. Yeah, because one tendency that I have seen with a lot of developers and even designers is the tendency to use a font size that just looks good on the screen. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes what that boils down to is like, in the same page, you have like 5, 6 different font sizes, which once the entire page is ready, it doesn't really, go that well with a lot of UX designers, like, because it's not very appealing to the eyes when there are like too many font sizes all put together in the same page. Uh, so yeah. So coming back to this constraint-based design, so you also mentioned about.
Mm-hmm.
I saw one of your tweets where you mentioned that the spacing between components and
Yeah.
even the sizes, everything should be. There is a science to it that it should ideally be multiples of a given number, like a multiples of 4 or 5 or any particular number that we choose.
Mm-hmm.
What's the concept behind that, and why should like how is that useful?
So the concept behind that is essentially this thing called modular scales, and it's like I think I was slightly, what do you call it, tongue in cheek when I made that tweet, right? It's like this is the science behind it, and there's no art, but it's kind of like more, what do you say, subjective. Like a lot of art also comes from math and science, essentially, right? Like a lot of things that are visually appealing to us are appealing to us because in nature they are the same way, right? Like these ratios and symmetry comes from nature.
Yeah.
So like art and design itself are like giant fields. But one thing that is like more practical that I kind of took with the designers that I worked with is that they always try to be on some sort of grid system, right? So they're either pick like an 8-point grid or a 4-point grid, or very rarely like a 5-point grid. And that kind of helps them to create this symmetry or this rhythm in their application, right? So for example, if you look at this, but actually I think I broke this example. So let me open my tweet. Sorry, I'm gonna quickly try to find it. Media, ignore the spam. Okay. So in this example, I kind of essentially tried to say that like this UI on the left looks good because it has this vertical rhythm going on.
Hmm.
And the easiest way to create vertical rhythm, if you're like me, if you're not a designer, is to create some constraints for yourself. right? So what I've learned is essentially if you create like a spacing scale, right? So instead of saying that I want 12 pixels or if I want 10 pixels, right? You say I want 3 units of space. And if that feels too less, I'm going to bump it to 4 units of scale and then 5 units of scale. So instead of like really going by your eye and seeing what exact pixel value do I want, you instead go by these many units of scale. And
Okay.
then to define those units, it's useful to be on a grid system. So for example, here, I'm on an 8-point system, right? So my minimum space that I can give something is 8 pixels. And then anything after that is like a unit of 8. And what's important is like you see the margins between elements is 24 pixels in this example. But even when things are smaller, where you don't want a lot of space like this label, it's still a multiple of 8. It's 1 unit of space. And while I was creating this example, I realized that 24 pixel on the top looks good, but 24 pixels at the bottom looks like a lot because the button is very heavy. So then I had to reduce it, but I did not have to reduce it arbitrarily. I went from 24, which is 4 units of space, or sorry, 3 units of space, to 16, which is 2 units of space. And it kind of still, I mean, that's how it still really looks good.
Yeah. So, yeah, I remember like once one of my UX designers, he also gave me this thing. Like he always told me that, you keep, his number was 42. I don't know why. And he said like everything should be multiples of 42. And then we used to always calculate and put it over there. But because the base number was so big, one
Mm-hmm.
problem that we definitely faced was sometimes we wanted something a little arbitrary between 42 and 84, like
Yeah.
something like 60. So
Yeah.
do you think have you faced those kind of problems wherein you would want to keep this kind of spacing which is linear, but
Mm-hmm.
then sometimes a 5 pixel gap in the same UI would probably look good, or
Mm-hmm.
a 6 or 7 would look good?
Um, yes and no. So I think 42 is like, I think it's more important to have a number than to have like a perfect number. Although 42, like you're right, it's kind of like way too big for at least like application work, right? So something that I've learned is that uh, the 8-point grid is the most popular one essentially. But if you're building applications, right, you kind of have a lot less space to work with. So even when you look at GitHub, there's a lot of things happening here, right? Like you don't always have the luxury of being 8 pixels wide. I mean, I'm looking at the new GitHub design, so this is still a lot spacious.
Yeah.
Uh, but if you're working in like application land, you kind of have very less space. Like this, the UI is more populated essentially. So in React, I've tried to ship like the 4-point scale, right, which is 8-point scale, but half of it, right? So 1 unit of space is 4 pixels or 4 points. Uh, and then essentially, every time I have to make a decision, I go from 1 unit of space to 2 unit of space to 3. There are very, very rare occasions. Okay, let me rephrase it. So if you're building a blog, right, a blog or a documentation site, is by definition more spacious, right? The font sizes are bigger, there's more white space in them. So over there, using an 8-point grid or even like a 10-point grid would be really nice. But when you're in an application, you kind of want to reassess your scales first. So like what I like to do is use a 4-point scale. And then you still run into like very rarely, like once a month, I run into a use case where I can't have 4 pixels. I need something smaller. And then I basically just say, I'm going to hard code 2 pixels here. Right. So that's the other thing of it. Like these, I think it's very tempting to look at these as like ESLint rules, right? Which is it's this or it's nothing. Like you
Yeah.
can't break these, but that's rarely how it works in design. So these are like useful constraints to put on yourself, but sometimes you essentially have to break the constraint, right? I'll give an example. Icon alignment, right? So when you're working with like a really small icon and it's inside a button, you don't have four pixel space to run around, right? So you're really working with a small one. So it's okay if you say, I'm just going to make it 2 pixels, half a unit, because this
Yeah.
is such a small use case, right? I would still be afraid of doing something like 5 and 7, uh, but you totally can, right? The rules are there to help, not to follow, right?
Yeah.
So
So
if you have to break them, you should.
yeah. Yeah, especially the example that you talked about, like when you want to have an icon within a button where there is already space constraint, then
Yeah.
having a bigger chunk of space left there gets it a little bit difficult. Like I remember in my last project when I was working with Tailwind, who had a similar scale,
Mm-hmm.
and I
Mm-hmm.
had the scale numbers as 1, 2, 3, 4, and there was 4.5, and then 5, 6, 7 like that, so that I can
Yeah.
incorporate something in between. So it was still following the
I
scale. It was
mean,
just the half of it. Like,
I mean, that's kind of, I would say that's kind of cheating,
yeah,
because like if your scale is not like something which is useful with spacing is that your
yeah,
scale is linear,
yeah,
right? Like it's almost like these many units of something. So
yeah,
if you need a number in between, it's fine, but I would not put it in the scale. I would just say this use case is special enough to break
mm.
the scale, and it's fine. Like the scale is there to help. You can break
So
it. Like that example is perfect.
yeah, and since this is a linear scale, is there a way to, instead of let's say specifying 0 to 16 in this case, I just specify what is the base of my scale, and then I can just use x in that, like let's say a 2x, 3x, 4x like that.
Yeah, like I think there's an issue about this as well. I really like that idea. I've been playing around with it, because there are some places where I wanted more than
Yeah,
16. It's like a sidebar is 240 pixels, which is still on my 4 point scale, but it's a big number. And it would be really cool if I can just say, give it, I don't know, like 16 into 4.
actually, I
Um,
did the same thing with my Tailwind also. Like when I actually needed to have like 240 or 320, so I divided that by 4 and just had like one abrupt number like that in that scale. So
yeah, so it's something that I'm definitely thinking about, but it's slightly trickier in the API. Like for the simple reason that this is still what do you say? Like the config is a guiding principle. It's still not a rule, right? So for
yeah,
example, if you wanted to do 4.5, that shouldn't really be here, right? But with a multiplier, you can do whatever, right? So that's, have you seen this thing happen with REM values,
hmm.
right? Where people say, I really want 13 pixels. So I'm going to say 13 divided by 16, and whatever that value is, it's
Yeah,
that many REMs, right?
yeah,
So you're still following like a scale by saying REM values, but then you're arbitrarily calculating it. So
yeah,
that's why it's somewhere in between. Like there's something about convenience versus like the guidelines of it,
yeah.
like the constraints. And I think using a multiplier, it can be easy to basically forget that you put
Mhm.
constraints for a reason. But all up in the air, I'm still building this out.
Yeah. And one more use case that I see where it might be useful is, let's say when I'm building my application in the initial stages of it, I want to see whether
Mm-hmm.
a 4 pointer scale works better or a 8 pointer or a 2 pointer like that. So at that
Yeah.
time, if I'm changing values, if it's hard coded, I'll have to probably go and change the entire thing. But if it's like just the base value, I can probably play around and see what works.
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
since you brought the, so every question that I ask, you end the answer with a term, which is actually to my next question. So that helps as a good reminder to me to to pick up my next question. So you just mentioned about the REM values, right? So
Mm.
a lot of us we are not really aware about what's really the difference between a PX, a pixel-based dimension, or EM or REM. Can you give us a quick brief about what those are, and where would you prefer to use a pixel versus a REM?
Yeah. Um, so the okay, so the let me give you two answers, right? The first one is that all the design work that essentially happens in an absolute scale, right? So when your designer is in Sketch or Figma, there is no relative concept there. You basically are always in one unit, right? And that unit could be whatever. So it's usually pixels. But when you're on the web, uh, browsers have accessibility features. So for example, like if you go to like a very, like a hipster design website where like somebody with a really good eyesight and a really good screen designed it, and they've picked like something like a 12 pixel font size. Now you can't read it, right? So browsers have always had this feature, which is for accessibility, where you can bump the font size. And I'm not talking about like control plus and minus. You can essentially say my browser's default font size is 20 pixels, right?
Mm.
Because I can't see that well, so I want everything to be bigger. And if you're using pixels, you're basically breaking that feature because pixels is a hard-coded unit. But when you use a relative unit like M or rem, that is in relation to a certain font size. So the most typical one is you say your body has a font size of something, right? So you say body has font size of 16, let's say, and then everywhere you mention a value, you say I want 2 rem, right? Which will give you body size multiplied by 2, so you get 32 pixels. And then when somebody wants to change the font size from their browser settings and then say I can't see, I want a bigger size, they what changes is the body size. So the browser overrides the font size of the body to say, let's say 20 or 24. And then if you're using rem, then all of the rest of the application scales accordingly, right? Everything becomes bigger in the same ratio. So on the web, we should basically always use rem or m. That's kind of the answer there. uh, but the other trick with rem value is that it's really hard to work with,
Mhm.
because at least for me, I can't think in ratios. I need like an easier method to think about it.
Yeah, like
So
1.125 versus 1.135 is very difficult to figure out,
right,
right?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. So like you, like even though like it makes sense, like this is bigger, but in your mind you can't really think about it that way. So what's always nicer is that, like what I'm kind of like converging towards is when you have a spacing scale, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And then over here I've shown in rem, but how I came with these rem is I essentially made the 8 pixel 16 pixel first, and then I calculated these rem values. So what I'm going to render always is the rem values, but I'm still thinking in my head in like 1, 2, 3, 4, or multiplying it by 8 in my mind when I do it.
Yeah.
So as an authoring experience, it's nicer to just be able to think in pixels as long as the what is rendered is in rem. So if you look at the scale in React UI, there's an issue, there's a pull request. We're still discussing what's the best approach. The scale is defined in pixels, and then the pull request that we have converts this into rem. So when you say use 2 units of space, you're thinking I'm using 8 pixels, and it gets converted into like 8 by
zero point 0.5.
16.5, right? So that's kind of one of the approaches that we're thinking. The other approach is basically just say you have to mention rem values. Uh, so like something like this, where you calculate it for yourself and then you convert it to rem. And those are like the two different approaches that we're thinking about. Like should it be explicit by the user or should we do it behind the scenes?
Okay.
But
And
at the end, like rendering stage, you want to use rem. That's kind of the story.
and do you use like REM only for spacing and pixels for font sizes like that, or do you recommend like using REM for everything?
And rem for everything. So I guess the key there is that anything that is in a unit can be based on a rem size, based on the font size of the body. So all your font sizes can be rem. All your spacing can be a rem unit based on that same number. So it's essentially kind of like, if you think about it, it's defining a unit, right? That's what the browsers let you do. Like whatever is the font size of your body, that becomes 1 unit. And then everywhere else you can multiply by that. So if you're using rem for one thing, then it kind of becomes important to use it for everything,
Mhm.
because your space, your font size, your border width, all of these should be together, right?
Yeah,
If one of them scales and the other one doesn't, then your UI would break.
yeah, yeah. I think in Tailwind,
Mm-hmm.
I might be wrong. I don't remember it correctly. I saw they were using margin and padding as REMs and
Mm-hmm.
height and width as pixels. So, or the other way around. So I was not sure why
Interesting.
they were doing it. So,
Yeah, I'm pretty sure their font sizes and space units are rem, but maybe width and height are not. I
yeah.
don't know.
And one problem that I have seen, especially with REM, is debugging on the browser, like in my inspect element. generally we want to use the arrow keys to bring it up or down, right? It's easier with a pixel because it goes one pixel at a time.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult with a rem because it increases the measure value of the rem. Like, if it is 1.25, it will make it 2.25 and not 1.5.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Um, I mean, that's a great point, and that's honestly something that I'm struggling. Not struggling. I'm unhappy with what I have here as well, because what I want is to jump from one space value to two space value, right?
hmm,
And when I'm debugging in the browser, it goes from 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have to mentally remember, and it's
yeah,
still easy with space because it's a scale. When you talk about font sizes, I don't remember what font sizes I have here, right? So I
yeah,
always have to like do it in the browser, see if I'm on the right thing, go back to the editor, realize I'm on the wrong thing. Uh, I'm really interested in playing with CSS variables because CSS variables are kind of built for a similar purpose, right? You can build all your values and then the browsers understand CSS variables. So you can toggle between those variables instead of hard coded values.
yeah. That makes sense. Or have you tried any other tool to debug your CSS rather than just the browser inspect element?
Kind of. So I'm also like working on like that's like a experimental project where I'm trying to see if React UI can have a dev tool of its own,
Okay. Yeah,
right?
that makes a
Because
lot of sense because, yeah, because you're trying to create an abstraction over these actual values, right? So if
yeah,
you can work with those abstractions, like if I can just specify my unit numbers instead of the actual values, then it will make things much easier.
exactly. Yeah, you want to debug at the abstraction level that you're authoring,
Yeah.
not what is being rendered. Yep.
So, yeah, coming back to the next is one. What's the bundle size of the library in production, and like,
And I'm gonna check it out. React UI. Let's see. Let's open any pull request. It is. Oh, sorry. I'll have to find my own pull request.
you're really fast with all this navigation. For
I'm
me to do
so
this much, it would
used to
have
them.
taken like 2 hours already.
So it's right now it's at 16.8 kilobytes.
Okay.
So this includes Emotion.js and like a fork of style system and the responsive API. So it has like a bunch of dependencies all bundled in.
Okay.
Uh, but then there are like two caveats to this. The first one is the library is not complete. So
Hmm.
this will definitely go up. And the other thing is like it's tree shakeable.
Hmm.
So if you configure your Webpack to remove all the parts that you don't use, then you're basically only paying for the components that you actually use.
Okay. Yeah,
So
16 KB is quite reasonable to add a UI library. But what really happens is today there are like too many libraries of 16 KB that I'll be adding to my application, and then
totally,
that kind of cumulatively adds up quite a lot.
yeah, that's very true.
So have you thought about any caching strategy or anything like that for the user? Let's say if as a end user, if I load it once,
Mhm.
how can I benefit from that for the next time?
And one approach that is still like it's I think there's everything you say I say like there's an issue, which basically means I'm not doing enough work on this. There's an issue to explore like other build systems. So for example, an ES build system or a UMD build, right? Like one you can just drop in your script tag. So that would be like the easiest one. If caching is important, then you can use the script tag, put it in once, and then it's served from the CDN. And as long as you're using the same version, you would, for the same end user, you would never fetch it again.
Hmm.
But that then comes at the cost of you can't reshake this. You'll have to get the entire 16 KB once and save it,
Yeah.
even if you're using like 4 KBs out of the library, right? So there's like trade-offs over there, but
Yeah.
UMD builds are like the CDN cache is the default answer.
Yeah, this approach worked for us in one of the enterprise application that I was building, wherein
Mm-hmm.
uh, I knew the end user. So I knew that okay, once they get like I could afford first of all to give them the entire library instead of tree shaking, and I
Mhm.
knew that okay, once they have it, they don't really need it, again. So
Yeah.
I had the leverage of just caching it the entire thing at their site, and change it only when the version of the library changes.
Mhm.
So yeah, but on the internet, it's a little tricky actually. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I've been playing around with is that essentially when you use React UI, you have two layers of React. One is the core, and the second is your token system,
Mm.
right? So if you cache the core, you only are messing with your own tokens, right? So even if you're adding more tokens, you're only paying for that JavaScript object, like 4 or 5 lines of diff. And that is what you wouldn't want to cache, right? That's the
Right.
one you want to keep changing. But the core library can essentially be cached forever.
Yeah. Do you have like a recommended Webpack config wherein user can actually separate out the core and the tokens into like separate JavaScript bundles?
Oh, so we kind of went slightly, what do you say, in the opposite direction, where the wait, do I have like a getting started? Okay, let me go to the Code Sandbox example. Uh, App. So this is what the import looks like. So you have the theme provider and all of the components from React UI, and then you have tokens and components as a different import, right? So if you're using one of the default themes, then you can cache this as well. But if you're creating your own theme, then you define the tokens and components. And then essentially, like instead of going the Webpack config route, we've kind of made it into two different, I don't know, import statements essentially, where this is the core and it can always be cached. But the tokens of your applications are essentially a different, what do you say, abstraction altogether. So if I was using like a UMD build, I would remove this and put a script tag in my HTML to cache it forever.
Mm.
And this is what I would bundle into my application. So, and in that sense, it's like doesn't really matter which bundle you use because it's based on imports, right? So you don't need a special config to do it.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. So yeah, what's your take on inline styles? Like, do you have like a strong opinion for or against it, or is it like based
Dep
on situation?
Depends on what you mean with inline styles. So, uh,
So a lot of people, yeah. Uh,
like I've written some stuff about it where essentially there's like this, right? Which is you have a component and then you're saying CSS, which is a prop, and these are the styles which are connected to your tokens.
yeah.
Now, even though the syntax feels like inline styles, this will generate a class name and put it in the CSS, and then it's cacheable and performant and everything. That's like one part of it. But then inline style can also mean using a style tag, right? When you want to do something very specific where everywhere else is fine, but this one specific place, I want this to have extra margin, right? So you say
Mm.
style margin is -2 pixels, right?
Yeah.
That's my favorite. I think I have an example somewhere where I wanted like a form and I wanted to stack two things together. So I wanted a -2 pixel margin on it. So there are two parts of it, right? Inline, if your entire application is inline styles, not like this, but like style tags, then you kind of don't have reusability. And if you want reusability, then you're kind of missing out. Like you're getting more duplication, more code than you want. So
Yeah.
that's of course like if you do use components multiple times, then that's not ideal. But then there's the authoring experience of inline styles, where in this case I'm authoring, like I'm writing my code as if it's inline styles, but it's actually not. It gets rendered as CSS and class names and then deduplicated and everything. So this I absolutely love. It's like I want to
Mm.
feel like I'm writing inline styles
Mm.
because that's how you think, right? I'm writing this header, but this header component should have this much margin. So I want to put that on the header component itself, the place I use it, and not somewhere hidden, right? Or I don't want to create a new component for this, which is like a header on homepage,
Yeah.
which uses extends the header and added extra margin. Like all of that is extra code and extra, what do you call it? I think the word is like misdirection or indirection, which is you're just like doing the same thing, but you're
Hmm.
doing it in a roundabout way.
Hmm.
So I really like the authoring experience of inline style, but I don't want to pay the performance cost of it, right? So that's one of the reasons where like CSS and JS fits really well over here.
Yeah, yeah. One of the situations where I've seen inline styles being used quite a lot is maybe it's not related to React that much, but when you want to load the initial screen of your application without loading an extra CSS file,
Mhm.
I've seen people using inline styles there to be quick over there.
Do you still call them inline styles? I, I mean, they
So
are inlined into your HTML, but they
yeah,
might not be
yeah,
on the
they might sit as a
DOM,
separate CSS class also within the same HTML. So
right? Yeah,
yeah,
but I get your point.
yeah.
It's like you don't want to
Hmm.
load an extra file, so you
Hmm.
put it in the same chunk that goes together to the user. That totally
Yeah.
makes sense.
And so these styles are all scoped. Like, let's say, if I provide a style for one component, does it leak
Mhm.
into my children component?
um, Leak into the children component. So scoped in the sense of like if I say header has, actually let me show you a component which would
So,
kind
for
of
example, let's
help.
say if I specify a font color,
Yeah.
like a foreground color for a component,
Mm-hmm.
and let's say that's my header, and that
Mm-hmm.
has a menu which is sitting inside that. If I don't specify a foreground color for my menu, will the color of the header get into the menu?
Yeah. So essentially you have something like this where in my, like I have this avatar, right? And I'm passing the CSS, like the experience of inline styles, but not actually inline styles. And I'm passing these styles. So these will get applied, but then if I have like a color, that will also go to the children because of CSS cascade, right?
Hmm.
So we scope the styles to a component, but then we don't try to break CSS cascading, which is kind of like the main CSS feature is like cascading style sheets.
Hmm.
So yeah, so that stays.
Okay. So, because one of the problems that I have faced is, let's say I created one beautifully looking component, like a complex one. Let's say it's a drop down which has the
Mm-hmm.
user avatars being shown, right?
Yeah,
And while building that component, I took care that, okay, the avatars have to show properly in line. They should all be left justified, the names and all show one below the other. Now I use this in
yeah,
my parent component, wherein let's say I used it in a div which has a text alignment mentioned as center. So what happens is my entire component, the
mm-hmm.
text, everything goes center, because
Mm-hmm.
while building the component, I had not really given it explicitly as text left, because I thought that
Yeah,
that's a default one. And
yeah,
that happens with a lot of styling, wherein you don't really give explicit style statements for your component.
yeah,
And sometimes what you set on your parent kind of gets applied to the children. So
yeah,
if I have like a shadow DOM there, or a scope of my style there, then it
yeah.
can kind of block everything to percolate down. Like, for example, we have the
I
video component in HTML5, right? Whatever
mm,
I do in the parent or the container of the video component, it doesn't get applied to the video
yeah,
tag itself.
yeah, yeah. That's a really interesting one. So I mean, it's hard to kind of see where, like, what's the right answer there, because it is a feature, like it's a feature of the language,
Hmm.
and then a lot of times we actually rely on that feature itself,
Yeah.
right? So for example, for font size, you set it on the body, and then unless you change the font size in the component, everything should take the body size, and that's a feature, right? So even with React UI, if you look at something like the text component, even though it accepts sizes, uh, if you don't give it a size, it uses the default size and it inherits from the parent. Like in our CSS, we actually say font size inherit
Hmm.
because we want to inherit it from the parent. Like that's almost like a feature. But I do see a point where, it's like, because it cascades down, it also like all the styles that you don't want to cascade also cascade down.
Mm.
So even when you talked about like something like what do you call it, like shadow styling and like the scoping behavior, which is with CSS scope, they still always follow the cascade, right? So I have seen some
Yeah.
implementations which kind of like remove all the styles from the parent that are coming and then
Mm.
attach new ones. But then you almost have to like do extra work in that case. So
Mm.
I'm very conflicted on this topic because I have thought about the other approach as well. Like with React, I wanted to actually follow the other approach where each child is independent
Mm.
of its parents. But then I kind of like circled back to using the cascade because I realized like I actually like the cascade and
Mm.
it gives you more features than bugs.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
I
yeah,
think
it's
another
all to
case
get
for
used to
that.
it.
Another case where I saw that probably working is like the scoped CSS or the Shadow DOM was
Mhm.
mostly in Angular and Vue applications. I've seen that, for
Yeah.
example, if I have a Vue application, in the SAS block of it, I can specify a keyword as scoped. And if I
Mhm.
specify that, then at least I can define class names
Mhm.
which I can be assured that these are unique to this particular component. Let's say if I
Yeah.
define the same class name in two different
Yeah.
components, they will at least not clash with each other.
Yeah,
So,
so I think those are two different, like you're right, they're both part of scoping, but
hmm.
then one is
That's a
like,
different problem. Yeah.
it's like one getting scope from siblings
Hmm.
and getting scope from children,
Hmm.
right? So scope from children is something that at least like React UI doesn't try to do at all. But scope from siblings is totally like that's a feature that I absolutely need and love. So
Sure.
for
Yeah.
example, you have a header here, and then in the CSS, you can do sudo, but you can also do something like a link, right?
Yeah.
So you can say the A tag. And then
Yeah.
this anchor is only applicable in the header, right? So all the anchors in the header will get this color, but nothing outside. Similarly, you can simply say like the link component, give it the colored link, right? So I
Yeah.
totally like this is more similar to like the scope feature that Vue has,
Yeah.
where they say in like starting now inside this component, all of the classes or all of the selectors I create should be scoped inside. That's
Yeah.
that's super useful. I like that.
Yeah. Probably, yeah, this is probably a bigger problem that has been solved with the scope variables rather than the cascading part, because as you mentioned, cascading is more of a feature that we would like to have for our components. And anything shared between siblings or within the from one component to another all throughout the application, that can be handled using scopes. So you already have
Yeah,
a issue on that, like you're going to, you already have this feature or you're going to work on that?
yeah.
Okay.
I mean the siblings like the scope
Okay.
like this is
Hmm.
already there.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
So, have you used this library in the wild? Like, although it's in beta, have you tried it out in the wild? Like, how it looks like in any of your side projects or personal ones?
Yeah. So I have like two examples of this where I've used it. Where do I
I thought
see?
you were just going to open the React UI.dev web page itself and show it. Like, this is the
No,
one.
I mean this of course is like the docs are built with the framework itself. I mean
Yeah.
that's like you'd expect that. So I
Yeah.
was building like a podcast player to test React UI out, and this whole thing uses React UI. With my internet is suddenly very bad. There you go. Right. So I was using React UI to create this, and then I got excited and used a bunch of more things. So there's like a drag and animation. So I've kind of like tried to combine. I think it was React Spring, and because I wanted to see like can React UI play well with other libraries, right? So this podcast application uses React UI and React Spring, but then
Wow.
also there's like this other application which is this one that is running this. Uh, Code Sandbox also uses like a fork of React UI. So I've been building React UI as an open source project, but I've also been building it inside Code Sandbox itself. So like the syntax that you see, the responsive syntax and the components that you see here are also like they're also being used inside Code Sandbox as well.
Okay. Wow,
So
that's
Code
nice.
Sandbox is more like the bigger project that uses it.
Yeah, if it works in Code Sandbox, then definitely it's a big use case, for it to be working, because there's a lot of use of that.
I mean, I hope so. Like there's one thing which is like cheating in Code Sandbox, which is like I work in Code Sandbox, right?
Yeah.
So it's like me using my own library to build my like day job work isn't really like much of validation, but it's like it's tested at like a more complicated UI at least.
Yeah, that's nice. So yeah, I think we are coming to the end for chat. So one final question for a lot of us, especially those are you new to the front end field. They do want to get into open source contribution, but they don't really have a path to it. They can't really start directly with contributing to React or Angular or Vue like that. There aren't any good new issues that they can pick up, or there is a starting problem with that. So what do you suggest for new folks?
That's an interesting question. So I don't really have like actionable advice, but I can share like how I got into open source and how I think about it. So the thing that has always worked for me is when I'm using a library and I'm stuck in a certain place because either there is a bug or there is a missing concept in the documentation, or simply I run into something which I think would be a good feature but doesn't exist. That is when like I create an issue uh, to only like start a conversation with the author. And this is something which I think is like it's a barrier that you have to get over, right? Because it sounds like you're going to a stranger and
Yeah.
you're saying the thing that you built has this thing missing. Can I add it or can you add it? Right? It feels like a very like you would not do this in real life. Like you would
Yeah.
not go to somebody else's office, tap them on the shoulder and say,
Yeah.
I'm using your thing. Do you mind adding this? Right? But it's totally fine to do it in the context of open source because like that's how the library is built, right? It's built for others to use, right? And it's built for feedback of others. So if you have something that you think is like either a feature that you want or a bug that you saw, or just like simply the documentation is missing some pages in it, then like to start a conversation with the author, create an issue, explain it nicely, like some don't just say a one line, like explain how did you come across this, what have you tried, what do you think could be a good fix, and then like through comments have a conversation, and then if they agree that it's a good idea, then offer, if you want to get involved, then offer your help that I can help implement it. And then that's when you get a pull request, and then they review it. So there is that like initial awkwardness of it that you have to ask them. And then here's the other thing, right? Like be okay with hearing no, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's one. Yeah.
Because some feature that you might think is a great idea, maybe they've already thought about it and decided that they don't want to build it because they want to like keep the library small. I think that happens to me a lot, where I like Reactor is probably the biggest project I'm building, but all my other projects are very, very small and they do only one thing. So sometimes I get a request and then I'm like, this is a good request. You should build it, but maybe as a different package because I don't want to add it to my project because then I have to maintain it.
Yeah.
Right?
Especially those who are new, there is definitely that apprehension of can I go and approach this person? And
It feels very odd at
yeah.
first, yeah.
So maybe documentation is actually a very good place to start with, because you know that, okay, it's quite safe. You're not really trying to change a piece of code. It's something easy to get into, and then you start working on that.
I'm not super sure. Like I've heard this advice a lot that
Mm.
documentation is an easy place to start. I'm honestly not sure about it because I've always struggled with that,
Mm.
right? Like good documentation is hard, right? Like we say documentation is an easy path, but it's not actually easy, right? Documentation
Mm.
is hard. And to write useful documentation, like it's easy to fix a bug in the documentation, but it's really hard to add a new section to it, right? Like
Yeah.
if you think an example is missing and you want to add it, you have to be a user of that library and you have to have like some experience with it.
Yeah.
right? So, like that's why I say the best path is to contribute to a library that you already use, because you at least have one perspective of using it, and then you can translate that into the perspective of somebody who builds it, and then your documentation examples would be nicer and your bug fixes would be nicer. Another thing that this is more like a, I don't know if this is like a helpful tip, but it's something I do, which is for libraries that I like and libraries that I use, I look at the issues sometimes, and like set myself like 30 minutes where I'm just going to try to find out what the issue is, right? So I look at the bug report, I see this is what somebody has reported is going wrong, and then I start diving in the code base, and I just try to like delete one line and see what happens, right? Or put a console log statement and see what comes out on the other end. So what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to understand what the library is, right? What does
Mm.
it do? And like, how do I reproduce this one thing that somebody has pointed out, right? Because honestly, for me, the biggest challenge in contributing to a library is that somebody has built it over time, right? Or multiple people have built it over multiple years. And you now say, I want to make a contribution today, right?
Mm.
In 1 hour, I want to add a feature, fix a bug. There is so much code that you have to understand first.
Yes.
So, it's like you join a new company, it takes you a while to understand how does this system work.
Yeah.
So what I try to do is like just spend some time in the library poking around, not with the intention that I will do a new release for this today, but more in the intention of I'll just try to understand this library a little more.
Yeah. One experience I remember, like when I started contributing to open source, I actually chose probably the wrong project because that was like a really big project.
Mm-hmm.
There was an issue that I had picked up, and it was actually something a very small change to be done because it was such a big project, I
Mm-hmm.
had to take care of so many things before I could just make that small change. Like
Yeah.
even things that we don't, when we are new to the industry, we don't really think about formatting a file and how the commit message should be and things like that. And every time I would create a PR, there would be a suggestion back, and then I would again create a
Yeah.
PR and suggestion back. And like unless your first PR gets accepted, it's a lot of apprehension for newbies. Like okay, okay, I'm not yet in there. Like my PR is still not there. I'm still
Yeah.
not contributing. So
I mean, I guess that part you will always face it. And
yeah.
that's kind of like it's almost like you have to ignore that part of it, because you're going to somebody else's project and but you have your own style. So when you write your code in your own style, they
Mm.
might suggest you changes based on their style. And then it's like when I was like, I want to say younger as if I'm like very old, but when I was like just getting into open source, I would argue with people, right? With something like silly, like, no, this code looks better because, you know, something as silly as like, do you put like semicolons or not put semicolons,
Mm.
or, should there be a block like those, what do you call them? Curly braces after an if statement, or should it be in one
Yeah.
line,
Yeah.
right? Because I had opinions and I had my own style. And
Mm.
over time, I realized that one, the styles are stupid, doesn't
Yeah.
matter at all. And second
Yeah.
is like if you're contributing to somebody else's project and they have to maintain it in the future, they will tell you their style and then you can just follow it
Yeah.
and move on, right? It's like the
Yeah.
style part of it is silly. And
Yeah. In fact,
what's more
Prettier
in,
has made it much easier now. Like you don't have a choice.
yeah. And now it's almost like I look forward to the feedback, because
Mm.
when I create something, right, and they tell me something, it's an opportunity for me to learn from their style, right? They do it differently for some reason,
Mm.
right? So I'm always curious, like, to get that feedback and see how somebody else would implement it. And it doesn't mean like I have to like it, but it's just there's always like the thing about open source, which is like my favorite thing, is that I can create a pull request, which will not only help someone, but also they will review my pull request for no money, for totally like take out their
Mm.
own free time, review my pull request and give me feedback. That's kind of a thing that you can't really get, right? It's the
Yeah.
same. You can't walk into like Facebook's office, go tap on Dan Abramov and say review
Yeah.
my PR, right? But if you create a pull request in any of his repos, he will review it.
Yeah.
So that's an amazing, I don't know, feature of open source that gets overlooked. It's like
Yeah.
it's something to be afraid of initially, but if you think about it, you're getting feedback from like just the developers you really like. So
Yeah. And the
that's a
best
great
part
feature.
is you get to meet and interact with so many good developers in the field. There's so much to learn.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's an amazing place to be in open source. Yeah. So yeah, that's about it. So thank you so much, Sid. It was awesome talking to you about this, and wish you all the good luck with React UI. Looking forward to the production version of it, like when it
Yeah, me
goes
too.
live. Yeah. Any timeline you have for it, or any
um,
milestone that you want to? Uh,
yeah, I do have like the next milestones. In like by the end of June, I want to reach like have enough components that I'm happy to call it like done-ish. Yeah.
yeah.
Like I don't think I'll ever be happy with it, but I want to like in 1 month I want to get to a space where I'm like, this is enough to do one release.
Yeah, that's always a problem, right? Like we always think that okay, we are still not ready, like
Yeah.
and but we were actually ready long
Like
back.
it's
So.
yeah, like it's never good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's mostly about convincing yourself like it's fine. Let
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, great. So all the best with that, and thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah.